Canada understood something immediately that others hesitated to accept. This wasn't about rhetoric, and it wasn't about ego. It was about whether borders still meant what they were supposed to mean. And what happened next surprised almost everyone. Canada didn't shout. It didn't threaten. It didn't posture. Instead, it moved quietly, deliberately, and ahead of the curve. And before Trump fully realized what he had triggered, France and Europe stepped in, not to mediate, but to draw a line. What followed wasn't escalation, it was containment. And the result flipped the entire dynamic on its head.
For years, international politics survived on an assumption that even when leaders spoke recklessly, restraint would eventually return. That assumption broke the moment Donald Trump spoke openly about Greenland and Canada as if sovereignty were flexible under pressure. Greenland isn't abstract land. It belongs to Denmark. It is protected by NATO. It sits at the center of Arctic shipping lanes, future energy access, and military positioning in the high north. When Trump floated ideas about taking, buying, or coercing control, it wasn't casual language. It was a signal that power, not law, could decide borders. For Canada, that was the alarm bell. If Greenland, backed by Europe and NATO, could be spoken about this way, then Canada's own sovereignty could just as easily be framed as conditional. The logic was simple and unsettling. If Greenland today, then who tomorrow? This wasn't paranoia, it was pattern recognition. And Canada didn't wait to see how far the test would go. But that wasn't the whole story. Canada's response wasn't emotional because the threat wasn't symbolic. Greenland sits at the edge of Canada's Arctic reality. What happens there directly affects Canadian security, trade routes, and long-term sovereignty in the north. For decades, Canada's instinct in moments of tension was to de-escalate quietly, smooth things over, assume good faith would eventually prevail. That instinct worked in a world where boundaries were respected, even when disagreements were loud. But this was different. Trump's rhetoric didn't rely on negotiation. It relied on intimidation. And intimidation only works if hesitation follows. Canada understood that silence could now be read as weakness. This wasn't about responding loudly, it was about responding correctly. And that meant positioning, not posturing. Canada didn't need to threaten Trump to counter him. It needed to remove his leverage before it could be used. And that's where the strategy shifted. When Mark Carney stepped in, there was no dramatic condemnation, no personal attacks, no theatrical speeches. Instead, Canada aligned itself clearly and visibly with Denmark. The message was precise. Borders are not bargaining chips. Territorial integrity is not rhetorical. And the Arctic is not open to intimidation. This wasn't symbolic solidarity. It was legal, political, and strategic alignment. Carney understood something Trump consistently underestimates. No country confronts coercion alone and wins. Pressure only works when isolation exists. Remove isolation, and pressure collapses. But the real strength of Carney's response wasn't visible in that moment. It had been built quietly, months earlier, far from the cameras. And that groundwork changed everything. Long before Trump's rhetoric escalated publicly, Carney had been rebuilding trust across Europe. Not through grand announcements, but through consistency. Reinforcing shared norms. Restoring Canada's reputation as a stabilizing actor rather than a reactive one. When threats expanded from Ukraine to Venezuela to Greenland, Europe didn't hesitate this time. The groundwork had already been laid. That's the difference between scrambling for allies and having them ready. When Trump's comments crossed from provocative to destabilizing, European leaders didn't wait for Canada to ask for support. They spoke up. And that moment marked a quiet but decisive shift. Canada was no longer standing alone. It had moved from vulnerability to deterrence without firing a word back. Then, France made it unmistakable. When Emmanuel Macron publicly warned that Trump's threats against Canada and its sovereignty endangered the global order, it sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles. This wasn't routine disagreement. It was a direct call-out of behavior that had previously been tolerated as disruptive but manageable. Macron's statement mattered because it reframed the issue. This wasn't Canada versus the United States, it was rules versus raw power. For years, allies had absorbed pressure quietly, hoping it would pass. France didn't absorb it, it rejected it. And that rejection signaled to others that silence was no longer the safest option. Canada's position became a shared position, and shared positions are harder to bully. But Trump wasn't done escalating. By the time Greenland entered the conversation, a pattern was already visible. This wasn't an isolated remark or a one-off escalation. Before Greenland, there was Ukraine. Each time Donald Trump hinted that sovereignty could be pressured, traded, or treated as conditional, the same playbook appeared. Support became transactional. Legitimacy was questioned. Boundaries were blurred just enough to test reactions. And each time, Canada responded the same way. Quietly, deliberately, and on the opposite side of that logic. When Ukraine's sovereignty was put under strain through conditional language and political bargaining, Canada didn't argue in headlines. It doubled down on recognition, visibility, and legitimacy. Ukraine was treated as sovereign, equal, and non-negotiable. The same approach carried over when narratives began forming around Venezuela. Reports and political rhetoric suggested exaggerated claims of threats and instability. These claims were widely disputed, but the strategy behind them was familiar. Establish a danger, repeat it often enough, then use it to justify coercion. Canada didn't amplify those narratives, it sidestepped them. Threats were answered with alliances. Pressure was met with coordination. Silence was replaced with visible alignment. This wasn't coincidence, it was rehearsal. By the time Greenland surfaced, Canada's response wasn't improvised, it was already practiced. And that's when intimidation started losing its power. What happened next exposed a flaw in the intimidation strategy. Each time pressure was applied, the outcome moved in the opposite direction. Instead of isolating Canada, the threats began to unite countries that might otherwise have stayed cautious or silent. Every escalation narrowed options instead of expanding them. Canada never raised its voice, but its circle kept getting wider. European capitals closed ranks. Arctic stakeholders coordinated quietly. NATO partners took note. What was meant to intimidate started to consolidate resistance. This shift mattered because leverage depends on hesitation. Once hesitation disappears, pressure loses its bite. Canada's response removed the uncertainty Trump relied on. There was no guessing where Canada stood or who stood with it. Alignment was visible, early, and difficult to fracture. The cost of pushing further stopped being emotional or rhetorical. It became political and diplomatic, the kind of cost that doesn't fade with news cycles. What made this especially damaging was timing. Canada didn't wait for a crisis to peak. It acted before escalation could fully form. That denied Trump the space he typically uses to force concessions. Every new statement only reinforced the coalition already forming against him. Instead of gaining leverage, he triggered unity. And once unity locks in, intimidation turns into self-inflicted pressure. The Greenland episode was never really about Greenland. It was about the Arctic and who controls what comes next. As ice continues to retreat, the high north is no longer a frozen buffer. It's becoming a strategic crossroads. New shipping lanes are opening, cutting weeks off global trade routes. Energy reserves, once locked beneath ice, are becoming accessible. Military positioning in the Arctic is shifting from symbolic presence to real leverage. And at the center of all of it sits Canada. For Canada, defending Greenland's sovereignty wasn't an act of solidarity alone. It was self-preservation. Greenland's status sets a precedent for how Arctic territory is treated. If pressure and coercion are allowed there, the same logic can be applied across the entire northern region. That would place Canada's own Arctic claims, infrastructure, and security posture at risk. The response, therefore, had to be decisive but measured.
not loud enough to escalate, but firm enough to define limits. What Canada signaled was subtle and deliberate. The Arctic is not governed by whoever moves first or shouts the loudest. It is governed by law, agreements, and alliances built over decades. This message resonated far beyond Denmark. Arctic nations, European powers, and global observers understood what was at stake. If the Arctic becomes a zone of intimidation, it reshapes global trade and security overnight. Trump's miscalculation was assuming the Arctic could be pressured the way other regions had been. Instead, the moment he tested that idea, the region hardened around rules. Canada didn't block a move, it removed the opening entirely. By defending Greenland, Canada was defending a future where Arctic power is shared, regulated, and predictable. And once that future was publicly reinforced, the leverage that intimidation depends on quietly disappeared. Canada never issued a threat, and that was the point. It didn't need to match volume with volume or rhetoric with rhetoric. Instead, it demonstrated something far more effective. Early coordination beats late confrontation. What Donald Trump appeared to expect was hesitation, silence, or a slow diplomatic response that could be exploited. What he encountered instead was alignment, already in motion before the pressure fully formed. That difference changed everything. For decades, Canada's instinct in moments of tension was to calm, soften, and assume restraint would eventually be rewarded. That approach worked in a system where borders were respected even during disputes. But this moment required a different calculation. When sovereignty itself began to be spoken about as negotiable, ambiguity stopped being safe. Canada adjusted accordingly, not with bravado, but with structure. It didn't escalate the confrontation, it closed off pathways for escalation altogether. The Greenland episode revealed the limits of intimidation in a connected world. Each attempt to apply pressure only widened the coalition standing in opposition. Every sharp statement produced more unity, not more leverage. Canada understood that power today isn't just about who can threaten the most, but about who can make threats ineffective before they land. By the time the implications became clear, the window for coercion had already closed. What made this outcome decisive was timing. Canada didn't wait to see how bad things might get. It acted while the situation was still forming, shaping the response rather than reacting to it.